going, everyone? It's Colin from Havoc Performance. To the right of me, I have a 97 Viper GTS. If you subscribe to the magazine or are a member of the VOA, this car may look a little familiar to you. That's because this is the cover car of the latest issue. It has a really good write-up about the fully restored interior done by Vinzano Interiors, along with our head and cam package. Today we're going to go over how to install the big brake kit for these Vipers using the Gen 3, Gen 4 brake calipers that was just recently finished. And make sure that you keep an eye out for the preview video that we're going to make of this, showing off everything that's been done to this car. So yeah, let's get into it. Today we are demonstrating how to do rear brake conversion on a Gen 2 using the Gen 3, 4 brake calipers. First, you're going to start by removing the e-brake cable. You simply grab a vice grip, take it, pull out and over, and it releases it like that. You then cut the zip tie here and pull the cable out of your way. With the parking brake cable out of the way, we are now going to remove the factory brake caliper. You need a 15mm socket for here and a 6mm hex socket for here. And then we're going to hang this up out of the way to continue the installation. With the factory brake caliper out of the way and the rotor removed, we have to now remove these ears for the knuckle in order to fit the big brake kit and the parking brake kit. We are going to remove the hub bearing just because we were replacing the hub bearing anyway. And on the other side, when we did this, I found it made the cutting process a bit easier. If you leave the wheel bearing in there, you kind of have to go down an angle and then grind the surface flat in order to fit the actual brake caliper on here. So if you are going to remove the wheel bearing, what you need to do is remove this cotter pin with this collar on here. There is a spring behind here, so just make sure you don't lose that. You're going to remove the nut with the 32mm, and then there's 4 19mm back here that you have to remove. And usually these bearings come out fairly easily, so not a lot of force should be necessary. If you do run into an issue where you do have a bit of force necessary to remove the wheel bearing, sometimes you can kind of hit the ears of the wheel bearing side to side, and that should walk it out. Usually we don't find that's not necessary on these Vipers. Okay, so now with the wheel bearing removed, we are now going to cut the knuckle along this line. The reason we are doing this, number one, is that the rotor that we are putting on the back for the big brake conversion will not fit because it will actually hit along right here on the knuckle itself. And on top of it, we need to install this for the brake caliper, which actually mounts to the back side of the hub bearing. So as you can see, this is very clearly in the way. Now if you make this cut and you go to test fit this and you notice, oh, I still need a little bit more room, all you're going to do is you're going to take a die grinder or something to grind some of this material down, so that way this does sit without interference. And on the side note, if you are going to remove the wheel bearing, you need to make sure you retain this shim which sits behind the wheel bearing. It sits in between here like this. So you have the wheel bearing in front of it, the shim, then the knuckle. So let's go ahead and cut that out. So this is what's going to look like when you have both brake caliper mounting brackets attached to the knuckle. You're going to use the hardware that they provide, just because the factory hardware is not long enough. You're going to use a little bit of blue Loctite since we have to reuse the factory wheel bearing just for demonstration purposes, so the one we got was wrong. That's why you don't see any blue Loctite right there, but when we get the new wire bearing, we're going to use the appropriate Loctite and torque down to 110 foot-pounds. Now we're going to move on to the parking brake caliper installation and then the main brake caliper installation. This is the new parking brake assembly that's going to be used on our big brake conversion kit. It comes together assembled in packaging. I just separated it for demonstration purposes. This is the main bracket that the parking brake mounts onto. These go to the backside of the wheel bearing hub, and the parking brake mounts right here. This is the parking brake itself. There's a little, this is to adjust, and I'll explain how to adjust that into what specifications when it's on the car. There are spacers right here that sit between the brake caliper mounting bracket and the backside of this bracket itself. So when I get it on the car, I'll kind of go into more detail about that. Here we have the parking brake caliper mounted. We use a little bit of blue Loctite on the caliper bolts that bolt into the bracket and torque down to 45 foot-pounds. Next, I'm going to show you what you have to do to reroute the parking brake cable. You need to remove the 13 millimeter head bolt from the parking brake cable holder, and then we are going to reroute it so it goes over through the front here, over top, and through here. And I'll show you how that looks when it's finished. So here's how the cable is routed. It's routed on the front portion of the control arm and back around through here. The instructions tell you just to zip tie it. I go a little above and beyond, and that hold down for the cable that we took off, let's see if I can get a good, yeah, right there, that little bracket that the bolt slides through, I actually use a flat blade screwdriver, separate it and spin it around so you can remount it to the frame. Again, that's optional, but I find that holds the cable up a lot better. Next, we're going to show you what you need to do to check and adjust the clearance between the parking brake and the rotor. So to adjust the parking brake, you need a 1/2 inch wrench to adjust the nut right here in the middle. The specifications is between 5 thousandths to 10 thousandths. We are going to be using 8 thousandths of an inch. And I'm going to show you what it's like when the clearance is too tight. You can't actually get it in there. Usually I try to check on 3 points, each side in the middle. So because right there, I'm able to get it in, but it gets tight, and I'm not able to get it around, we're going to adjust that just a little bit. Now it's important that when you do this, you have 2 lug nuts kind of hand tight on the rotor, just so it's not cocked, and just make sure it's really flush on there. We do need to use the front rotors for the rear because the hub actually won't sit around the center of the rim. So when you go ahead and do this, if you're using Stoptech, I think is what we're using here, order 2 sets of front rotors. Front rotors do work on the rear, and frankly is what you're going to need because, like I said, the rotor won't sit over the wheel bearing hub. Alright, so as you see, we have the brake caliper mounted. It is important to note the position of the bleeders. They need to be in the upright position, otherwise you're not going to be able to bleed the brakes properly. Then you're going to go ahead with a 10 millimeter hex and you're going to tighten these down to 85 foot-pounds. Okay, so as you can see, we have the brake pads and hardware installed. Doing the brake pads on these are really simple. You take the pads, you slide them in. You just got to make sure that you have grease on the edges where it rides along in here. I usually put them on the backside too, where the pistons are. Apparently that helps for noise reduction. And then usually the easiest way to get these in is you lubricate the pins. You put the top pin in. You take the shim here. I always lubricate on the bottom side here that rides against the pad and along here where the pins slot in. And then you take it, you wedge it underneath here and push it down, and then you push the bottom pin in. And on the back side, you take a punch and you just gently tap it in until it seats flush fully up here. It shouldn't take a lot of pressure if you're finding to really hammer it in, something is not aligned. So just be careful when you tap that in. It's real light force to get those in fully seated. Okay, so we now have the brake line installed. It is important to make sure you have both copper crush washers on either side of the brake hose. You're going to tighten down the banjo bolt to 23 foot-pounds. I find it best to route the hose so it's angled up towards the control arm, and you zip tie it in with the brake cable. That way you don't have to deal with any interference of the brake hose and ruining a perfectly good brake hose. And then you're going to install the brake pads. Alright, so we got the finished product in the rear. Like I said, we did replace the rear wheel bearing. If you do go ahead and replace the rear wheel bearing, you need to make sure that you tighten the axle nut to 190 foot-pounds and make sure you replace it with a new cotter pin. So the installation of the fronts is a little less in depth than the rear because you don't actually have to cut anything on the knuckle. It's fairly simple. You're just going to remove these 2 bolts for the wheel bearing. You're actually going to replace these with the hardware that they supply for the big brake kit. You're going to torque these down to 45 foot-pounds. You are going to remove the front brake caliper here, and you're going to apply these to 85 foot-pounds. Make sure you apply a little bit of Loctite to all the bolts here. And then you're going to install the caliper and torque these to 85 foot-pounds, and then installation of the brake pads is the same as the rear. and then you're going to go ahead and start bleeding all your brakes. Just like in the rears, we did replace the front wheel bearings as well. One thing to note, this little axle stub here is meant to help keep the wheel bearing together. What they do from factory is they actually put a little notch in the threads to help prevent that nut from walking out. When you do take that off and you have to put it on the new wheel bearing, odds are it will kind of mar up the threads a bit. We actually had to send it out because we didn't have the proper tap and die to do this. You're going to need a 22 by 150 tap and die because there's a really significant chance that those threads will become damaged and you're not going to be able to get it into the new wheel bearing, which is essential to have in the new wheel bearing if you do need to replace front wheel bearings on the road.
Thanks for watching our video today, guys. Make sure you like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel along with our Havoc Performance Instagram to stay current with all the Viper information and all the Viper things that we're going to be doing, and not to mention to be hanging out with us and Marvin and seeing everything that goes on at the shop. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.